Okay, so we're continuing our discussion of Emmanuel Levinas's Useless Suffering, his essay from Entre Nous. It's found in Entre Nous, translated by Michael Smith and Barbara Harshav, and published by Columbia University Press in 1998. Again, in order to understand these lectures, you are going to need to get this book and read this essay. This is the fourth this is on the fourth section, but I'm actually going to do three mini lectures on this final section because I think I need to do some background for you to fully appreciate what Levinas is doing. So I'm going to do my first lecture is going to be about this book, my book, For the Love of All Creatures, Story of Grace in Genesis, but not really about the whole book, but about a particular chapter in it, or about Thomas Hobbes and his landmark and seminal publication, Leviathan. And you'll see Hobbes refer to, you'll see rather Levinas refer to Hobbes in this final section. But to really understand what Levinas is up to, he just makes a passing reference, assumes people know what he's talking about. I need to get you into understanding Hobbes and his implications for modern Western philosophy and ethics. So the first step I'm going to do is use my treatment of Hobbes in this book, and I'll be reading you excerpts from the book and talking about Hobbes in that context and relating it a bit to Levinas as a preliminary lecture, right? So that'll be the first one. And then after that, I'm going to build on that by putting by looking at pieces of an essay I published in the Journal of Animal Ethics. The title is Peter Singer, Emmanuel Levinas, Christian Agape, and the Spiritual Heart of Animal Liberation. Singer is a modern ethicist who now lives wholly within the modern world, which Hobbes anticipates brilliantly way back in the 17th century. And Singer is dealing with what has become a crisis of foundations in ethics, a legitimization crisis in political theory, the problems that come from modern rationality when it tries to become ethical. The problems which Levinas is so attractive for redressing. I mean, so it's modern Western secular intellectuals are drawn to Levinas because it looks like he can address this issue. But I'm not sure they can understand how he's doing it in his terms. But anyway, with Singer, Levinas, and I'm going to focus here on Singer so you can see the implications of where Hobbes goes. And I'm not going to do the whole article. I'm just going to read the excerpts that are about Singer and ethics. And then I'll recommend the rest of the article to you if you want to see how I relate Singer, Levinas, and Christian Agape. But that's not what I'm going to do here. This is all going to be a setup for that final reading that final section. So finally, that'll be the second of the three mini lectures. The third mini lecture on this final short section of useless suffering will then be the final one I offer in the light of that. But because I've done this prior work, we're going to be able to understand what Levinas says with far more depth and nuance. Levinas isn't writing for us. Levinas, and this is true of a lot of European philosophers, and in particular French philosophers, they don't write to be understood by average people. They write to be understood by their peers. So they presume huge philosophical understanding when they write. And that's what I'm going to try and fill in a bit here for us so we can really understand the significance of what Levinas is saying in this final section. So we'll turn now to the first of the mini lectures for Love of All Creatures. Okay, so what I want to do to start is to give you some sense of Hobbes and Hobbesian thought. Hobbes is the author of Leviathan. I'll discuss that in a minute, so let me not go into that here. But Levinas will make reference to him, and to understand what he's making reference to, it's important to understand Hobbes and 20th century ethics in light of the predominant modern Western meta-narrative. Okay, I'm going to make all of this clear in a minute by talking about first a chapter on Hobbes in my book, For the Love of All Creatures, the story of grace in Genesis. I'm simply going to read some sections of that I've highlighted out. You can, of course, get that book. This is by Erdman's Press in you can see the title there. Let me go a couple of pages so you can see. There's the copyright information. Unfortunately, they got my name wrong. It's not William P. It's William Greenway. And if my full name is William Norman Alexander Greenway Jr., which I don't put on. It's just a bit much, but somehow they got a P in there. I don't know how. Okay, so what I want to do is read from. You can see the different chapters here. So I'm doing a comparison between Genesis and the Enuma Elish, which is the ancient Near Eastern counterpoint to Genesis. In other words, this is the creation narrative of the Babylonians, where the Israelites are in exile. When they're in exile, the exilic period, that's an exile in Babylon. So they were very familiar with the ancient Near Eastern Babylonian creation narrative, which is called the Enuma Elish. And in fact, the Genesis 1 to 11, the primeval history, and for instance, the 7 days of creation narrative, but the final form of Genesis 1 to 11 is actually written in either in the end of the exilic period or just afterwards. So the Enuma Elish and the primeval history, the Genesis creation narratives in their final form, and the Enuma Elish should be read in conversation with one another. They're in direct dialogue in that day, in the ancient Near East. And then the Leviathan I'm putting forward is our modern Western counterpoint. And then I argue that actually, spiritually, the Enuma Elish is superior to our modern Western creation narrative, where what a creation narrative is a reference to is some ultimate picture, cosmogony or cosmology, one's ultimate picture of the character of reality. We have that in the modern West, just as they had it in the ancient Near East. And the course of the book is arguing that the Enuma Elish, when it comes to spiritual and ethical matters, is superior to our modern cosmological narrative, which is often called Darwinism or materialism, which Hobbes is a major force for. Obviously, our science is superior. Darwinian biology is far superior to ancient biology. Our sciences are far superior to ancient sciences. Sometimes people assume that means, well, then everything that we do is superior to the ancients. I'm arguing that no, actually, Enuma Elish is, in philosophical terms, in terms of spirituality and ethics, those dimensions of its cosmology or creation narrative are superior to the modern creation narrative, and that the Genesis creation narrative is superior even to the Enuma Elish. Anyway, that's the meta argument of the entire book. You can get the book and read that. What I want you to do is just, pick out this chapter 3, Leviathan, the modern Western counterpoint, and simply read you excerpts that will give you some of the key aspects of Hobbes and modern political theory and social theory. So this is chapter 3, the modern counterpoint, the dominant secular creation narrative of the modern West. In the modern West, the creation narrative that offers the most influential alternative to the primeval history of Genesis is the creation narrative of materialism. It is worth repeating Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett is an extraordinarily prominent philosopher from Tufts University, very influential in late 20th and early 21st century philosophy, especially in theories of consciousness and the mind. Anyway, so this is his summary of materialism, which I've quoted already in chapter 1 of this book. Materialism. There is only one sort of stuff, matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. And the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. According to materialists, we can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. It is one of the main burdens of this book, and this is a book called Consciousness Explained, is one of the main burdens of this book, which got all sorts of awards, was nationally celebrated, burden of this book to explain consciousness without ever giving in to the siren song of dualism. So materialism, or nowadays it's there's materialism 2.0 or new materialism. There's all sorts of variations now on a mechanistic materialism, ones that are more organismic, organic, richer, include nature and nurture. But none of these new ones are fundamentally different in kind from the old versions in terms of their appeal to a brute flux, which is ultimate, which may have some degrees of indeterminacy, but which is and may be have mimetic levels where language memes take precedence over other memes. It's just still nature and nurture, maybe in richer ways of understanding. There might be emergence of minds in a sense, but the root understanding is not different in the so-called materialism 2.0 or the new naturalisms that are coming out. In fact, as I think I've already told you in another one of these talks, if you look at the current Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it's a great online resource for philosophy if you want a go-to place on the web that you can rely on. The entry for naturalism, which is only a year or two old, starts out by saying that naturalism has no clear definition in contemporary philosophy. That's how much everything's up for grabs. Nonetheless, this sort of naturalism, which says the basic stuff is matter or strings or flux or something like that, that still is the predominant form of naturalism in Anglophone in particular, and global streams of philosophy. In popular culture, the materialist creation narrative is commonly called Darwinism. While Darwin played a pivotal role in legitimating materialism, however, because he gave some explanation for the emergence of complexity, which it wasn't clear how mechanism could explain that because of the principle of entropy. Darwin solves that problem on materialist terms. While he played a pivotal role in legitimating materialism, however, the essentials of materialism were in place and influential long before his book, The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or this is the full title of the book, which often people don't know, The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. That's the grounds upon which the book was used to advance a hegemonist European racist agenda, was published, which I don't think we should saddle Darwin with that, but nonetheless it was easily appropriated for that. The essence of materialism was in place long before 1859, when Darwin's Origins was published. Now, Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which was published in 1651, is a powerful defense of monarchical government that Hobbes wrote amidst the bloody English Civil War. In comparison to influential 17th century contemporaries such as René Descartes, the so-called father of modern philosophy, Hobbes' influence on mainstream intellectual traditions in the 18th and 19th centuries was marginal. Hobbes' thought became ascendant in the 20th century as Descartes' star faded, especially in the later 20th century. For Hobbes had already in the 17th century anticipated the philosophical materialism that would become predominant among intellectuals in the 20th century and so far in the 21st century. So again, you can read, I'm skipping a lot to give you just some of the essence of this. To reiterate, the world is wholly physical for Hobbes. All knowledge originates in sense impressions, and there are only two valid kinds of knowledge. Knowledge of fact, what there is, and of science, the connections among what there is, the causal flux. Note well that once this simple set of premises is accepted, that all knowledge It originates in sense impressions, and there are only two valid kinds of knowledge: knowledge of fact and knowledge of science, relationship among the facts of the matter about the world. Once this simple set of premises is accepted, and these premises came to be seen by predominant 20th century intellectuals, really globally, as unquestionable, wholesale materialism, in the broad sense that I've defined it, simply follows. All voluntary motion, then, including thinking, is motivated by our desires and aversions and is determined in relation to our factual and scientific knowledge as we strive to move toward what we desire and to avoid what we dislike, right? So the question is, why facts and science? Why do we want that? Well, it's because we want to have information that we can use for our voluntary motion, right? So there's involuntary motion, which is out there everywhere, but then there's what we have, which is voluntary motion, which is motivated by our desires and aversions and determined in relation to our factual and scientific knowledge as we strive to move towards what we desire and to avoid what we dislike. For Hobbes, this motivational relationship among voluntary action, aversions, and desires has the status of an inviolable universal law. I'm quoting now from Leviathan: "Of the voluntary acts of every man, the object is some good to himself." The reader should note that good and evil, then, are not originally applicable to any event or action in and of itself. Good and evil are originally defined. They have to be. There's nowhere else to go, in terms of an individual's desires and aversions. Thus, all action, that is, all voluntary motion, right? So I might, I'm breathing, but that's not an action. That's an event, because it just kind of happens. It's involuntary. When I decide to do this lecture, though, it's voluntary. And all action is necessarily selfish and is action in pursuit of one's own desires, one's own good. In other words, the reason I'm doing this ultimately is because this turned out to be a good way I could make a living. Maybe I could have done better doing other things, but this is where I ended up. And maybe I wasn't as great as I could have been at realizing what I wanted for my selfish ends. But insofar as I'm doing this, ultimately the reason is because it is in pursuit of my own desires, my own good. It might be that I tell you it's not, because that works towards my own desires, but ultimately the ultimate reason we know it has to be because there's no other possible conceptual ways to go, given those original premises, than other than that I'm doing it for my own good, in terms of it being voluntary. It might be involuntary in the sense that I've simply been conditioned to think this is what is good and what I should do. I've been conditioned at a level I'm not even aware of, right, by genes and memes, by nature and nurture, to buy into a certain way of living my life, thinking ultimately that's what I should be doing. But that would be involuntary for Hobbes, right, that I would be driven that way. So one can draw a distinction still on these grounds between self-interest and enlightened self-interest, but it's confused and unrealistic to make any appeal beyond self-interest. There is nothing that is good and lovely that is not good and lovely for me, for some me. Hobbes realizes that his materialist premises, right, and he's realizing the implications of materialism in the 16th century, right? This is where he's brilliant, right? He's working out issues which are really going to emerge across the board in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, right? As a crisis, a legitimization crisis in politics, or a crisis of foundation in ethics. Hobbes is seeing it already here when he's writing the Leviathan in the 16th century. So, what is it? The 17th century, right? 16. What was it? 1651, 17th century. Sorry for that mess. All right. So, Hobbes realizes already then that his materialist premises dictate that all ethical ideals will need to be re-articulated in terms of self-interest. And he takes care to provide these new definitions. So, in other words, when you've heard the phrase, when we've talked about politics or political theory or things like that, enlightened self-interest, that's Hobbes. And that's Hobbes working within the confines of self-interest, right? So this is, once you realize there's nothing beyond self-interest, but you want to get beyond a narrow self-interest, then you need to find a way to introduce a category of enlightened self-interest. So whenever you've talked or thought in terms of enlightened self-interest, you're already working within Hobbes' world, even though you don't know it. All right. For instance, and he takes care to provide these new definitions for things. For instance, he defines pity as grief for the calamity of another. But he is careful to add, pity ultimately stems from self-interest because it ariseth from the imagination that the like calamity may befall oneself. Pity for another, then, is really a form of concern for oneself. And today we might interpret such seemingly altruistic dynamics in terms of kinship altruism or reciprocal altruism. All right, that would be how this pity would be worked in. Okay, so it's probably obvious given our other lectures, but this definition of pity for the calamity of another is about as direct an opposition as we can get from what Levinas says happens when he's overtaken by the calamity of another versus Hobbes. Right. So, and what Levinas realizes is Hobbes' definition of this. Okay, what's happening when what Levinas is going to talk about in terms of an inner human order, which is visible when I'm taken hostage by the face of another. Right. He is going to, in this point, say that that Hobbes' notion of what's really going on there is pity, which arises from the, it's actually, I'm really concerned here about myself, ultimately. This is a latent self-interest. Levinas is realizing that Hobbes is driven to that conclusion by these background premises that he has. But he realizes, and as if you read my book, as Hobbes realizes too, these background premises are not given. They are not absolutely given as true. They themselves are a product of a huge set of deductions about the character of knowledge, which exclude all knowledge which is not rooted in sense impressions. But why make that exclusion? That is a philosophical argument, right, for that paradigm, that materialist metaphysical picture, one which for Levinas is exploded in that encounter when he is taken hostage by the face of the other, screaming, "Do not kill me, do not hurt me." That's where Levinas, who is fully aware and actually goes into the camps within this materialist realm, plus maybe the freedom Heidegger opens up for creativity of eyes, for that sign, which emerge as a different sort of being, and this ultimately will be a part of what undercuts materialism on this trajectory. Levinas, so just to know, Levinas is not unaware of what he's doing when he claims this is an other sort of relation. This is other than that which can fit within modern Western metaphysical parameters, other than what Hobbes says it must be. And it's on the basis of his recognition that Hobbes, this whole metaphysical paradigm, is itself a conclusion of a very sophisticated philosophical argument, all sorts of presuppositions. It's not just given that he's going to have these experiences in the camps and think the Hobbesian explanation of what he is undergoing, the realities he's encountering, is completely insufficient and unwarranted. In other words, the background presumptions that it must be reduced to this, he finds unwarranted. All right, so Hobbes' materialist pity for another then, I just want to make clear that you're getting this connection as I do this. This is why I'm going to here when I'm doing this essay, Useless Suffering. Pity for another then is really a form of concern for oneself. Today we might interpret such seemingly altruistic dynamics in terms of kinship altruism or reciprocal altruism. And if you know what those are, there's no denying the accuracy of kinship altruism and reciprocal altruism as biological categories. And I think, as maybe I've said even before in this series, that's significant to know about, right? Because even though it's not altruism in the sense of a reality of love, it's about genetic conditioning over time. Right, it's still important to know because as one would expect, given this, and as it turns out to be the case, when it comes, for instance, to issues of abuse within families, Adopted children are far more at risk of being abused than natural-born children, and where there's the genetic tie. And that difference would be explained by the biological dynamics of genetic, or rather kinship altruism. So that kinship altruism is accurate there, and it's true, and it gives us information about who might be at risk. So we might take mitigating actions in order to reduce the risk for adopted children because of this genetic power and force, which is indexed to risk of abuse. But the reason we care, Levinas is going to say, about children who are abused isn't because of genetic altruism. It's because we're taken hostage by their faces, right? So just to be clear, when I talk about when I talk about agape, or when Levinas is talking about being taken hostage by the face of the other, by the other, he is not denying the reality and power of these dynamics as they have been unfolded in very sophisticated scientific accounts, in accounts of kinship altruism, reciprocal altruism, maybe even group altruism, and selection. He's not discounting those. He's just saying they're not the whole story. They're insufficient to explain this other reality, the reality of why I actually want to use this data this way, the reality of why I care. Okay. So Hobbes' materialist understanding of human character allows him to generalize about the basic driving force that drives all human action. The object of man's desire is not to enjoy once only and for one instant of time, but to assure forever the way of his future desire. As a result, until we have secured sufficient power over and against nature and over and against other people to ensure that we will be able to gain whatever we desire, every person is above all consumed with a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth. I'm glad that word dropped out of the English language. I can't say it. Only in death. Only, that should be only in death. Only in death. That ceaseth only in death. I'm using his original English writing. So given every person's quest for power after power, and given every person's pursuit of his or her desires in an amoral world, it's not immoral, but amoral, there's just no morality to it, the ethical question becomes, why would anyone want to subordinate personal preferences and affirm and support a commonwealth that sustains and enforces shared standards of good and evil, most likely against many of one's own immediate and personal desires? So why would someone ever want to have a commonwealth then? Why not just, be engaged in pursuing what I want as much as I can get and to secure it for as long as I can? Why would I support anything against that? And the reason is humans, that would be the state of nature, right? No, nothing out there, no other thing out there which is limiting my pursuit of my interests. So, but humans who live in the state of nature are subject only to the state of nature, right? The laws of nature, which we've just given. And again, for Hobbes, it's a simple fact. And thus, the right of nature that each human always pursues his or her own good, which is first and foremost the pursuit of personal survival, and secondarily, the pursuit of security and pleasure. So survival in the moment, but security, and then even more than that, pleasure for the long term, as much as I can do it. That's what is basic in the state of nature. In the state of nature, moreover, there was no ethics, no right or wrong, no legal or illegal, no just or unjust. Indeed, there is nothing higher than individual desire. And Hobbes doesn't mince words on this. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have, in the state of nature, no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice, force and fraud are in war, and this is the war of nature, the state of nature, our natural state, before anything is organized. In war, force and fraud are the two cardinal virtues. The problem is that human life in the state of nature, a taste of which we get when societies disintegrate into civil war or ethnic conflict, is horrible. It is a primitive life full of, he says, continual fear and danger of violent death. It is a life which is, this is a famous quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Indeed, the horrors of human existence in the state of nature are so severe that even a peasant suffering under tyranny should prefer that commonwealth, even if it is tyrannical, to life in the state of nature. All of this sets up Hobbes's fundamental argument for commonwealths. Since in the state of war there can be no security to anyone, no matter how strong or wise they are, it follows that every person ought to endeavor peace as far as they have hope of obtaining it. And since this reasoning goes to the most self-interested, fundamental self-interested good, and is had in common by every person, Hobbes holds that this is the first and fundamental law of nature. And from this then follows a second law. It is that everyone should, in the interest of securing peace, be willing to lay down his or her right to all things, and now I'm quoting again. I'm assuming you're reading along so you know what I'm quoting and not, and be contented with so much liberty against others, men, as he would allow men against himself. In more familiar terms, my rights end where yours begin. And if you've heard that language, if that's familiar language, again, that is where our society has simply absorbed Hobbes. Hobbes is drawing these as conclusions. Today, that tends to be just something that people take as a given. But it presumes this atomism, this egoism, this war of all against all in the state of nature, which is going to be then by contract, by a social contract, mitigated against, because the state of nature is such a horrible state to be in. This is the linchpin of the social covenant or social contract, and in the face of this basic contract, good and evil first come into existence. That is, only in the wake of this basic contract can what is just or unjust, or what is legal or illegal, is at first created. The existence of a social contract, then, is the sole basis for all ethical, moral, legal understanding. So this is Hobbes' accomplishment, right? And he doesn't think there was some time back in time where we were in the state of nature, and then we all agreed in this explicit way, right, to form social contracts. But what he's describing here in this ideal sense is what he thinks happened in a de facto sort of a way, as we moved from more brutish forms of existence to more common. This is the logic behind that move and a justification for it, which allows us to free ourselves of the sort of, in his mind, were the mythological kind of religious justifications that were given to people to get them to do the right thing. This idea of there's a God watching, there's punishments in hell, and there's rewards in heaven, and that's what keeps everyone in line. As that delusion, in Hobbes' view, dies away, as we become alert to the fact of the actual character of reality, and there is no good and evil, this alternative understanding, this other meta-narrative, allows us to give a logic to a social contract, which is what we all participate in for the good, the self-interested good of all. So in this way, and under the social contract, killing another person only becomes wrong when the social contract prohibits it, that is, when it becomes illegal. Therefore, there are no inalienable rights, for there is no more. So our Constitution, with the notion of inalienable rights, that is neo-Cartesian, or even it's actually more Lockean, and Locke's more of an empiricist, but nonetheless, as an empiricist, Locke still believes that the good and even God, not particular gods, but God as a principle, can be had objectively through reason. Hobbes is already 150 years earlier beyond that point. He's where we are today, when there's no inalienable rights, there's no moral reality, indeed no rights until they're established by the social contract. However, even though this is a logic he's given, right, Hobbes is, and remember, Hobbes is writing in the wake of the English Civil War. He's a philosopher. You can't accuse him of doing pie in the sky philosophy. He is responding to being caught up in, and he was something of a political figure too in the day, caught up in one of the most vicious wars that ever happened. So it would be a naive, says Hobbes, to expect that societal enlightenment and delineation of the logic of the social contract could name our social passion. It could tame our natural passion. So he goes through this whole argument, but he doesn't expect people to be understanding this argument generally, and as a result of the understanding of this argument, to be creating a state to which they surrender some of their passions out of enlightened self-interest. So he says, covenants that are without the sword are but so many words, and of no strength to secure one at all. And the bonds of words, he says, are too weak to bridle men's ambitions, avarice, anger, and the other passions, unless there is fear of some coercive power. Ultimately, he says, the passion to be reckoned upon is fear. The Commonwealth's power over life, death, and imprisonment must be awesome enough to keep people in awe and faithful to the rule of law. Thus can peace be established only insofar as the Commonwealth, and he defends monarchy, but he doesn't care what it is, be it a monarchy or an assembly, is a great Leviathan, which has the use of so much power and strength that by terror thereof it is able to shape the will of all people to peace at home and mutual aid against their enemies abroad. Okay, so this is the Leviathan. He gives a logic justifying the state and the creation of a rule of peace, which he justifies by appeal to everyone's self-interest, because it's in our collective, it's any one person's self-interest on the whole, because no one is smart enough or strong enough to ensure that they can survive or to flourish, because there's going to be no society, no industry, no the rest in a state of nature. So it's in everyone's self-interest to engage in a system in which enlightened self-interest rules. But he says the logic of that isn't powerful enough in the real world. That's where you need the Leviathan. The Leviathan is the state. The motion to be counted on is fear. The Leviathan has to be a big enough monster with power of life and death to use fear to get people in awe and faithful to the rule of law. And then, by that terror of the Leviathan, then you can have peace at home and mutual aid against enemies abroad. So Hobbes provides the logic that justifies the Leviathan, but it is the fearsomeness of the Leviathan, not Hobbes' justifications, that can in fact shift us from the state of war to the state of peace. So for Hobbes, ultimate and original reality is nothing more than the state of nature, the state of war of every one against every other. So while this was a radical new idea in the 17th century, right? So to the degree we see this as just, common sense today, it's that testifies to the brilliance of Hobbes, 3 centuries ago. It had become a familiar image by the end of the 19th century even. Creatures engaged in a struggle for existence that is red in tooth and claw, the natural state in which self-interest and above all interest in survival is ultimate. Of course, this is the background frame of Darwinian theory. All right. The emergence of law and justice does not signal any shift in character or recognition of a moral realm. The emergence of law and justice of the state of peace can only originate from some permutation of selfish pursuit, from an enlightened selfishness to be sure, but selfishness nonetheless. Ultimately, insofar as Darwinism has been functioning in the modern Western, not simply as a well-established scientific theory, and I accept Darwinism as a scientific theory, about how species evolved or is the best scientific trajectory along which to investigate the origins of life within the cosmos, and I've got ahead of myself there. To be clear, I affirm evolutionary theory in these regards, but as a metaphysics cosmology creation narrative that, together with the other modern sciences, wholly addresses and explains all reality. So what I'm saying is insofar as Darwinism has become that, all right, which at the social political level is Hobbesian, right? Insofar as it's taken it's thought it wholly addresses and explains all reality. Modern secular society has largely, if unwittingly, embraced the amoral Hobbesian Darwinian vision of reality as its de facto creation narrative. When Darwinism is taken not merely as a scientific theory about an aspect of reality, but as a total theory, as a cosmology, our most profound moral apprehensions must be interpreted as products of the ways in which our brains have been programmed and conditioned to experience certain phenomena in accord with biological and sociocultural forces, nature and nurture, genes and memes. It is not difficult to discern how this gives indirect support and cover to those among us who are most immoral, since it denies a moral reality by which they might be judged. Unfortunately, modern Western society, the most technologically sophisticated and powerful society the world has ever seen, and of course, right now we have China rising up. In China, this materialism is, if anything, even more powerful than it is in the West. So the same background idea, which maybe the West is responsible for giving birth to, now has global reach, also in Russia. And it's just among cultural elites globally now. Our Hobbesian Darwinian metaphysic is predominant. And what I'm saying is insofar as it denies moral reality, and relies on fear to have people abide by social contracts, then people who think maybe they need not be fearful because they can get control of the society, they can succeed in their endeavors over and against others. This facilitates that logic because there's no moral reality that stands over and against them, right? So they have largely adopted Darwinism not merely as a promising, if still young, biological theory, but taken together with Hobbesian ideas as a fully formed creation narrative, a fully formed cosmology, understanding of the ultimate way things work. Unfortunately, while modern Western scholars have done good work explaining how the hierarchical character of medieval cosmology tended to reinforce hierarchical, patriarchal, and oppressive social and interfamiliar relationships in medieval society, right? A classic critique of feminism, how medieval vision of God and world, of all the hierarchies in nature that were natural, reinforced hierarchies in society. Modern Western scholars and others have done good work on that. They have not been as quick to note the brutal, unjust, and oppressive implications of Darwinian Hobbesian cosmology for modern society. In short, in the modern West, a Hobbesian Darwinian cosmology is functioning as an essentially, and not just in the modern West, globally, a Hobbesian Darwinian cosmology is functioning as an essentially religious creation narrative, the creation narrative of the modern secular sphere, the creation narrative of materialism. Insofar as materialism has spread from the West and across the globe, this is not merely a Western, but a global problem. Moreover, in the tried and true fashion of ideologies throughout history, materialism often illegitimately declares itself to be value neutral, to be free of any metaphysical entanglements, the latter supposedly only afflict religions, and to be the only legitimate arbiter of any real knowledge. Now, this is where the scapegoating of religion that's common among cultural elites globally, even as they pretend they don't have a meta-narrative, right? What they have is they just live in reality, in fact, right? This is unveiled as a systemic distortion, as an ideology which protects them and their interests, even as it attacks those bodies of knowledge, right? The classic teachings of the saints and prophets of all the world's great religious traditions, right? Which are overwhelmingly moral and would be immediately highly critical of the enormous inequities that are being perpetuated in contemporary global culture. This is where this is unmasked as not only not true, this attack on religions is somehow different from the neutrality of the secular, right? This is where people talk about being beyond metaphysics. That's absurd. Everyone has some metaphysic. Once you hear someone talking about after metaphysics or they don't have a metaphysic, you know you're in the presence of a very powerful ideology because you can deny that it is something other than something humanly influenced construction. That's where this is not only untrue, but it's not innocent, because the reigning ideology, which is supposedly just given, not religious, not in any way a product of where religion is seen as irrational, that's where it's not simply untrue, but it's an ideology that's harmful, right? Because it defends these sets of interests and self-interest and undercuts the moral objections that might be brought against it. Now, I disagree with Hobbes' theory, but I respect Hobbes. And I even suspect that he was moved to engage in such a difficult and potentially dangerous polemic. Again, he's way ahead of his time here. He's bringing into question God and the divine right of kings, all these sorts of things. He's trying to come up with a logic coming out of the English Civil War that's going to allow for a stable, right, creation of these ideal societies. His hopes, his ambitions are good. He's doing it within the world, the materialistic world, which he thinks now we know is the world, right? But it's interesting to step back and say, my goodness, what drove him? What did he see in the English Civil War? Right? What was the experiences there that drove him to spend such tremendous energy and to take such risk, right? Instead of just moving within the court to his advantage, to engage in this polemic. And what I'm suggesting is he may not be that unlike Levinas. It's just he feels like he has to work within these boundaries now. But he's actually moved to engage in such a difficult and potentially dangerous polemic because of his not at all selfish or self-interested sensitivity. In other words, because of his genuine sensitivity to and concern for all the suffering that surrounded him. I wonder whether or not we encounter a prototype in Hobbes. The prototype of people we should sincerely pity, not in the Hobbesian sense, but in the sense that we're moved by having been taken hostage for their faces. A phototype of people who in their daily living are truly awake to love for others, but who, due to the degree to which they are captured by modern Western materialist rationality, suffer in their theory, in the fullness of their understanding, and in the poetic richness of their spiritual articulations.